Welcome back, folks. This is Professor Allen from Brigham Young University. Today we're going to be looking at recording a macro in Microsoft Excel and edit it. Specifically, we'll be creating a list of stock tickers and then using the web query feature of Excel to automatically bring in data for each one of those stocks. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we dive into the Excel part, let's just take a look at the website that we're going to be working with. So I'm just going to go to finance.yahoo.com. Let's see if I can get there, finance.yahoo.com. And I'm going to just put in here a ticker over here as a quote lookup. So I'll put in, say, Apple, AAPL. And that will bring up information about how Apple's trading. Here's the current price per share. Here's the other information, the bid-ask spread, where it opened, price-earnings ratio, the earnings per share, and so forth. So what I'd like to do is I would like to be able to use data from this site and be able to bring in, say, the price-earnings ratio and the earnings per share for an arbitrary list of stocks. So the interesting thing to do first here is to look at this stock ticker. It's a little bit unusual in that it has the stock ticker here, and then again, question mark, and it has a parameter here with the same stock ticker. I'm going to get rid of that second one and just see if this behaves the same way if I just put that stock ticker in there once. If that's the case, then this will all get a little bit easier for me on the code side, and it looks like that does. And so here we have, just by putting the stock ticker here, after finance.yahoo.com/quote/ whatever ticker I put here, it'll bring that information up. And I could change this ticker, say, to go to Southwest Airlines, LUV. And that should now bring in information for Southwest Airlines, and so that's going to be really handy. And so that's the website that we're going to work with. Now let's go ahead and set up our Excel workbook to do what we want it to do. So let me go ahead and just delete this. So I've got a brand new blank worksheet, book 2, haven't even saved it yet. Let's go ahead and save this and give it a name. So I will, let's see, choose File, Save. And I guess I'll just put this on my desktop. I don't know how to get to my desktop. It's here somewhere. And desktop. Now I'm going to call this stock info. But instead of saving it as an XLSX, I'm going to choose macro-enabled workbook. And so that will be an XLSM file. If I save it as an XLSX, I will lose the macro that I'm about to record and modify. And so I want to make sure I've got this saved as an XLSM. All right, so I've got stockinfo.xlsm. Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to put a list of tickers here. So T-I-C-K-E-R. And then what I'd like is the price-earnings ratio and I'd like the earnings per share. I'll go ahead and list a few stock tickers here. Apple, AAPL, Google, Microsoft, Southwest Airlines, let's see, ExxonMobil, Ford, and GM. And the idea here is that we would have, could potentially have a lengthy list. The point is that it's an arbitrary list. The list is going to start in A2, and then it's going to go as long as we have contiguous stock tickers here. Now then, I want to be able to retrieve these two pieces of information, the price-earnings ratio and the earnings per share. And so I'm going to record myself doing this with a macro. And so I'm going to go ahead and I've got my page set up and ready to go. Before I start recording, I'm going to be sure that I want to make sure that I know which cell I'm going to start in. So when I run this macro, and the macro itself is really just going to pull in the information for one stock. And so when I run just that one macro, I want to think, where should the active cell be when the macro runs? And in this case, I'd like to indicate the stock that I'd like the information for by making that the active cell. And so because I want the macro to run when the active cell is on one of these stock tickers, I'm going to start on one of those stock tickers when I start recording the macro. I also want to think about where do I want the active cell to leave off when I'm done recording so that it's ready to run again. In this case, I want it to fill in the price-earnings ratio and the earnings per share, and then I would like to end up on the next row down on the stock ticker so I'm ready to run that macro again, and it will just go ahead and run. So I'll go ahead and start here on Southwest Airlines. And I'm ready now to record my macro. So right now my developer tab is already showing here, but if yours isn't, then it's pretty simple to do. Let's just go ahead and take a look at that quickly. You'll choose File, Options, and then you've got Customize Ribbon over here. And then here's the main tabs that you have on your ribbon, and by default developer isn't checked, so you just want to go ahead and check that developer tab, and then you'll have the developer tab, which has all the tools you need for manipulating and editing Mac. So one more thing before we start recording, I'm going to make sure I have my sheets named the way I want them to be named. And so I'm going to call this one, I'll just call this Tickers. And I'm going to add another tab here, and I'm going to call this Web Query. So now I'm ready to begin recording my macro. So I'll come here to the Developer tab, and I'll click right here on Record Macro. It's going to prompt me for a name. I'm going to call it Stock Info. I can give it a shortcut key. I could give it Control S, but Control S normally saves the current workbook. But if I record this macro and give it a shortcut key of Control S, it will now run this macro instead of running gets in my Stock Info macros, or instead of saving, it'll run this macro. So I'm going to put in here instead a capital S, which will change the shortcut key to Control plus Shift plus S. I'll store it in this workbook, and I'll go ahead and put in a description here that this gets the price earnings ratio and the earnings per share for the ticker in the active cell. All right, so as soon as I say OK, it's going to start recording everything that I do. So I'll say OK here. I'm going to copy my first. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy my active cell. So I've got this copied. Now I'm going to select my web query page, and I'm going to come and select C1. You'll see why we want it in C1 here in just a bit. And I will paste right here. So I've pasted the stock ticker that I'm after right now. Now, to be able to get the information from the web, I'm going to use a tool off of the Data tab of my workbook. So I'll come up here into the ribbon to my Data tab, and this first area, Get and Transform Data, I'm going to choose from Web. Now, if your first group doesn't look like this, it may be that you've got an older release of Excel 2016. So just make sure that you're updated to the most recent version. So I'll click on From Web, and it will bring up a little window here saying, all right, what URL do you want to go to? Well, I've got my URL here, so I'll just copy that right off of my browser, and I'll paste that in here. Of course, if you don't have that yet, you could just type it in, https://finance.yahoo.com/, and then whatever ticker you want. In this case, I'm putting LUE. So we'll say OK, and that will now communicate. Excel will communicate with that web server, and it will bring up this little wizard that'll help us choose the data that we're after. Now it comes up in table view, but there is a web view, and you can kind of see the page that we're after is located here. We've got Southwest Airlines, and that data we're after is just down here a little bit lower. Over here is price earnings ratio, earnings per share. We'll go back to table view, and it's not in the first block here. The second block is that first table. I want the next table, so that's this one here. And so I'll go ahead and say load. Now, you'll notice that when this tool loads that query, it's going to put it onto a new sheet. And we'll see the activity that's doing that. Ultimately, we're going to want that to come right here onto our web query sheet, but it's going to create a new sheet here in the interim. So let's go ahead and click load. We can see it's brought in that new sheet, and now it's brought the data in here. Here's our price earnings ratio and our earnings per share. So I'm going to pause recording my macro at this point, and we're going to go take a look and see what it's recorded and make some modifications to it. So I'm going to click on the stop button here. And now I want to go look at the macro that's been recorded. So back to my developer tab, and I'm going to come here to my list of macros. So I'll click on macros. It should bring up the macros I have available. I only have one. I've just started recording it, so it should be pretty easy to find. Here it is, stock info. I could run it right here, and it would actually cause problems if I ran it, because it'll try to create a new query with the same name, and that will cause an error. But let's go ahead and instead of running it, let's edit it. And now this will bring up the Visual Basic Editor for the language, VBA, Visual Basic for Applications, that's built right into Excel. So I'll click on Edit, and here we have the macro that we've created. It's called stock info, that's what I named it. Here's the little note that I put in there, gets the PE ratio and earnings per share for the ticker in the active cell. Has a little note here that the shortcut key is Control plus Shift plus S. And then here is the information that the actual activities of this macro. So the very first thing we did once we started recording was copy. So selection.copy, that just says, hey, whatever is selected, do the activity called copy. Then we said, hey, out of all the sheets, there's one called web query. Let's go ahead and select that. And then, hey, on that sheet, there's lots of ranges. One of them is just a single cell range called C1. We'll go ahead and select that. And then we're going to paste. So all those activities that we did, those got recorded in code. So now we've got application.cutCopy mode equals false. That just takes us out of that mode we're in when we're copying it. It indicates the cell that's been copied with a little flashing lights that go around it, and that's fine. So this then is the line that's creating the query that we're after. And so without going through all the detail here, we can just see, hey, we're in our active workbook, whichever workbook is active right now, there's a set of queries, a collection of queries, and we are going to add a new query to that collection. We're giving it a name. The name is going to be Table 1. We could change that name, or I'll just leave it the way it is here. And you can see that the source of this is going to be a web page, and you can see in here the URL that we're getting. So ultimately, we'll have to manipulate this, but for right now, it's pulling in just Southwest Airlines. Now that creates this new query object that's a part of the workbook. It's non-visual, we don't see it, but it'll be created there. Now here's the next line that's a little bit problematic. It says, in this active workbook, we want to talk about all the collection of all the worksheets that's there, and we want to add a new worksheet. That's what it did. It added a new worksheet to put this code onto that worksheet. And so I don't want this line to happen. I want this to go right onto the same worksheet that we have. And so I'm just going to either delete this line, or a little trick is I can put a single quote in front of it. In fact, all these up here, these lines up here that start with single quotes, they're not executable code. The single quote is a comment character. Just indicates to the interpreter, hey, this is not a line for the interpreter to try to figure out to do something. It's a note to a future programmer. And so I can do the same thing here. Just by turning this line into a comment, it will disable that line from executing. It's kind of nice when I'm just beginning to work with macros. Instead of deleting a line, then I'd have to figure out how to bring it back if I decided I didn't want to delete it in the first place. But if I just use the comment character, it disables it, and then I can remove it to re-enable it again if I want to. So what we've got here is we've created this query, and that will just happen the next time we run this macro. Then, after the query is created, we are going to we're going to create a new list object. So on the active worksheet, there's a collection of a bunch of list objects. Actually, the collection's empty when we start, but we're going to add a new list object. And we're going to be referring to the query table that belongs to that list object. And here we can see that this provider, where the data is coming from this list, it's looking for this location, Table 1. That's the query that we just created up here. And so the name of this query here needs to be tied into whatever we have here. So this is what's actually going to bring the data from that non-visual query and display it onto the sheet into a list object. And there's lots of other information here that we're just going to accept because we're not really into the details of everything that's going on here. But just to show you enough about what we have to do to get this to work for this example. So the key thing to realize here is that right here at the all these lines in here, it's configuring this list object, this table in Excel, and then right here it tells it to refresh. In other words, to pull the information from the query again. And that's what will bring the data in. And so, and then here's the end with, which ends this structure here, and then this end sub is the end of the macro. So macro starts with the keyword sub and ends with the keyword end sub. And so I'd like to do a couple more things right here after we've created the query. We've used that query to pull the information into the table in Excel. And now, because the next time I run this macro, I'd like to be able to create that query again. My code creates a query. It's a query named Table 1. So what I'm going to do at this point, after I've brought that data in, I am going to say, listen, in my active workbook, refer to all the list of queries, find the one called Table 1, and delete it. The action is going to be to delete it. I'm going to delete that because the next time I run this macro, I want to be able to create a new query, call it Table 1, and if I don't delete it, this is going to cause a problem. Now I've got a similar problem here, and that is if I try to create a new list object, if I try to create a new table right on top of the existing one, it's going to have the same kind of problem. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect that data from the table. I'm going to just turn it into a normal range of data instead of it being a table. And to do that, I'm going to say on my active sheet, here's my whole set of list objects. The list object named Table 1, and that's named right here. This is the line that gives it its name. Refer to the one named Table 1, and I'm going to give the unlist action. And so to be able to make this example work for us so it can go over and over again, after I create the query and then bring that query in to show the data, I'm going to delete the query and I'm going to disconnect the table from the data. Just delete the table structure, the list object, but I'm going to leave the data there. So now I should be able to run this again, and it should bring the data onto our web query sheet because I got rid of the line that adds a new sheet. And so actually, because this table already exists, that's going to be a problem for me. So I better go ahead and delete that first. So I'm going to run this line of code outside of this macro just by choosing View, Immediate Window. That brings up a window that I can use to just execute one line of code immediately. And I'll do this one here. Just got to get this run once. That will delete that query. And then I will run this line, which will disconnect the list box from the list. So now when I run this again, it should have room to create. It should have room to create the query, then create the list, and then it will delete them immediately. Once I've already got the data, I don't need the connection back to the web page anymore. So I'm going to start by deleting this sheet here that I don't need, this one that got added. I'll delete that, and I want to confirm it, yes. And I'll make sure that I'm over here on one of the stock tickers I want to be on. In case I'll go to Goog and I'll press Control-Shift-S, or come to my list of macros, find stock info, and say Run. That should go put the information for Google right here in column C, or the ticker symbol here in column C, and then it will bring in the data for Google. Okay, so far so good. To this point, I've got my data where I'm copying the active cell, I'm bringing it over here, putting it in column 3, and then I'm bringing in the data for a particular stock, but yet not yet the one that I put here in column C. If we go back to the code, click macro, bring up my list of macros, and then edit that one. Should take me back to my macros. We'll notice that even though I'm pasting that information there into C1, I'm not yet referring to that in the creation of the query. And so right here, it's hard-coded always to, well, it's a little bit sad, but the computer's looking for love, and it needs to be looking for Google in this case, or whatever I've put into range C1. Now, this is going to be a little bit confusing because this is what we refer to as a string literal. And VBA does something a little bit unusual. So a string literal is marked with double quotes. So if we look right here, here's a short little string literal right here. It says double quote and then LET. These first three characters are part of the formula for this query that's being created. And it starts with it's just these three characters. It starts with a double quote, ends with a double quote, and that's just a collection of characters. This next character is the ampersand symbol, and it's just going to say take whatever we have here and glue it on to what we have here. I don't want to worry right now about character number 13 and character number 10. But we have now here another string literal, starts with this quote, and it just goes right along to here. Now we have a problem if we want to put quotes inside of a quote terminated string, because when I get to the quote right here, if I just wanted to put quotes around this URL, I can't just put one quote there because that would terminate the string. So in VBA, when I want to put a quote inside of a double quote terminated string, I just put two of them next to each other. It seems like a little bit weird, but the way the interpreter looks at that is it says, oh, that's not really the end of the string here. That's just a quote inside this string. So when it comes along and interprets this little part of this string literal here, it says, oh, here's a quote. It's the beginning of the string, L-E-T, great. And it gets to this one and it goes, wait a minute, I think this is the end of the string. But let me peek ahead and see if the very next character is another double quote. And if it is, it'll go, oh, that's not really the end of the string. It's just a quote in the string. But in this case, the next character is not a double quote, and so it goes, that's the end of the string. And we're going to glue it onto something else. And we'll glue it onto something else and something else. That's what the ampersand does, concatenation. And then we get here, and it says, all right, we've got another collection of characters. We get right up to that double quote, and it goes, oh, I think that's the end of this string. Wait a minute, let me check ahead. And it goes, oh, no, that's another quote. So that's really just a quote inside the quote. And it says, okay, so I'm still working on this quote. I'm still working on this string. I got the S, the parenthesis. Now I've got a quote here, and now the H, T, 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 P, S, all the way up to right here. Now what I want to do here is I want to terminate the string right here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first highlight the data that I want to remove from this string. And so I'll delete that. And then I'm going to put in two quotes. So a double quote followed by another double quote. And then between those, I'm just going to put some space so I can see it. So now if I look at the first part of this string, I've got quote, and it says, oh great, here's a bunch of characters, all part of the string, looking good. It gets to that quote and thinks, I think that's the end of the string. Let me peek ahead. Oh, no, it's actually a quote in the string, and it keeps going along. It gets to this quote, and it goes, I think that's the end of the string. Let me peek ahead, and it goes, oh, space. Yep, that was the end of the string. It says, okay, so that's one string right up to here. Now, I've got to do something in here, but now, and here's where it gets a little bit, there's so many quotes here, it's a little bit hard to follow. This says, hey, we're starting a new string. It gets to this one and it thinks, oh, it was very short. There's nothing in it. I think that's the end of the string. But wait a minute, let's peek ahead and see if there's another quote here. And it goes, oh, the next character is a quote. So this two that we have showing here isn't really the end of the string. It's just a quote in the string. And it moves on to that one where it realizes, okay, that's the end of the string we're trying to put together here. So what I've just done is I've taken that whole long string literal that had the characters LUV inside of it, and now I'm ready to be able to splice in an expression that can be evaluated to whatever stock ticker is sitting in C1. And here's how I do it. I'm just going to end that one here. I'm going to concatenate, that's Shift 7. I'm going to concatenate range C1. Range C1. And I don't want to know the address of C1. I don't want to know the background color, what font it is. I want to know the value of C1. And then I will concatenate that right back onto whatever we have going on after this. So without taking the time to totally go through and explain this whole source, what we've done is we have replaced the characters LUV with this, what I have right here. Quote says, hey, terminate that string that comes before it. Now add on to the value of whatever is in cell C1, and then add that on to, and we've added this other quote here, which will start up that string again and add on this next collection of characters. So now when I run this, instead of it always running for Southwest Airlines, it should now bring in the information for whatever I have in C1. I'm just going to press Alt F11, which is the hotkey that will toggle me back and forth between my Excel and my VBA editor. That's Alt F11. So I'm going to come back here and I'll just notice that my earnings per share is 3.33 here. I'm going to come back to my tickers. I'll go to Apple and I'll press Control Shift S, and that should run that macro. And that has now brought in a different earnings per share. Now, why didn't it delete those columns? So to make sure that we have this happening right, I think the very first thing I'm going to have to do once I activate my web query sheet is I want to clear off all the cells of this sheet, because I don't want these to keep pushing over. It would would get messy. It would work okay, but it would get messy. So I'm going to first say I want to clear off all those cells. So Alt F11 will take me back to my editor, and right as soon as I activate, we copy. I'm not sure if I can clear that and have it paste as well. Let's give it a shot. So as soon as we activate this worksheet, I'm just going to say I want to clear all these cells. So all the cells on my active sheet, active sheet dot cells dot clear. Let's give that a shot. Come back to my tickers. I'll choose ExxonMobil, Control-Shift-S. And that's better. The data's going to come in, but it's gotten rid of the information that was there before. So while that's running, let me just come and review that code that we added in here. Here is the line of code that we added. Active sheet dot cells dot clear. That just says I'm not specifying any cells in particular. I want all the cells, and we'll clear all of those cells. And so it should take just a second more for us to pull that data in. And let's go back and take a look. Yeah, okay, so that data is in now just fine. At this point, we've got the code working pretty well. Depending on which cell is active here when we run the macro, it will now copy that cell over here to C1, and it will use that to bring in the data for that particular stock. So our next step from this point is to copy our price earnings ratio and our earnings per share and to bring it back over to the tickers sheet. And so to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and start recording again right here, and then we'll combine these two macros together into a single macro. So I'm going to come up to record macro again. I don't need to give it a shortcut key because this one's going to just ultimately will become part of my other macro. I'll leave it called macro 1 or whatever it comes up as, and we'll just start recording. And so since I'm after the price earnings ratio, I'm going to select that. That's going to record. Go to B4 and select it. I'll copy. I'll just do it by pressing Control C. I'll copy that cell. I'll come back now to tickers, and now I have a problem because if I click on B6, it's going to record B6 like an absolute reference, just whatever cell I go to. But what I really want to tell it is go one cell to the right of where the active cell is. And so to do that, I have a notion that's similar to absolute and relative references in a formula. I can use relative references when I'm recording, and that's the button right here on my developer tab. So if I toggle this on to say use relative references, now when I click on B6, it'll record offset one cell to the right of whatever's active and select that cell, whatever it is. And now I can paste this, so I'll go ahead and paste that value in. And now, again, I'm still on use relative references, so when I select earnings per share here, I'll be ready to paste into there. I'll come back to my web query page. I'll click down one. That's okay. I think I'm okay to do a relative offset here, so I still have relative references. I'll select that one. I'll copy. I'll come back to my ticker sheet. I'm already on the cell that I want to be on. I'll paste in here. And I'm almost done. All I have to do now is end up where I want the macro to end up when it's done running. So I'll click on the first column of the next row down. And because I'm on relative references, it will say go down one row and go backwards 2 columns. Now I'll stop recording, and I should be able to run that macro. Control-Shift-S should now bring in the data for Ford. But I have to connect these two macros together. And so I'm going to come back to my list of macros and edit. What does it matter which one I edit? Either one will take me there. They'll be right next to each other. So I'll edit this macro. Here's my stock info macro. If I scroll down, here's the end sub for that macro, and here's the starting of the next macro. Well, I don't really want to end the last one or start the next one, so I'll just delete that whole block. And so now it starts up here with sub stock info, and it ends way down here at the new end sub. I've just gotten rid of the ending and the starting of that other sub procedure in the middle. And so now it will pick up from here, and it will do the rest of these steps. So now I'm going to come back to my tickers tab. Here I am on Ford. I'll press Control-Shift-S. It should pull in the information for Ford. And now it's copied in the price-earnings ratio and the earnings per share. I'm on GM, Control-Shift-S. It should pull in the data for GM. And if I come back up here to Apple, Control-Shift-S, it should bring those in as well. And you can see that I could just keep pressing Control-Shift-S and pull in the data that I want. And of course I could keep pressing Control-Shift-S, and the truth is if I only had these 7 stock tickers, that's probably exactly what I'd do. But what if I had 700 stock tickers? My pinky's going to get tired from pressing Control-Shift-S all afternoon. So what I'd like to do is I would like to tell this macro, hey, let's begin in A2. I don't care where I am when I start. Let's jump to A2, and then let's continue to run that process until we've run out of stock tickers, until we end up with until we move on to a cell that has a blank value right here. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and clear this data out. And I'm going to come back to my Visual Basic editor. So Alt F11 is the quick way to toggle back to that. So what I have right now is I have a sub-procedure here called stock info that gets the stock info. Rather than modifying this one to do that, this is useful by itself. I could always press Control-Shift-S and just get these 2 pieces of information for whatever cell has the stock ticker, regardless of really where that is in the list or even in another part of my worksheet. So I'm going to leave that as a useful unit, and I'm going to create another one. I'll call this one Get All Stock Info. And you'll notice I'm not recording this macro, I'm just starting from scratch. So I've typed in the keyword sub, I've typed in the name of it. Now I should have these opening and closing parentheses, which is for some more advanced use that we may talk about later in a later video. But you'll notice that if I hit enter, the Visual Basic Editor is going to plug in some of this syntax for me. So it automatically adds in these parentheses and it adds in the end sub for me. So it's very thoughtful of it. So it's kind of saving me some work there. So what I'd like to do is well, first of all, I want Get All Stock Info to do exactly what Stock Info does. And here's the trick. I can make that happen just by saying call stock info. And so now these 2 sub-procedures do exactly the same thing. And I mean exactly because all Get Stock Info does is it just calls stock info. It's going to just go and do this. But before I do that, I want to make sure that I'm on the right sheet. And so I've got a sheet here called ticker, and I've got code down here that selects that. So rather than type it, I'm just going to copy that in. I'm just going to say, hey, let's start off by making sure that we're on that sheet. Select my ticker sheet, and I want to make sure that I'm on range A2. That's where my data begin. And so I'm going to change this to range A2 dot select. So that looks pretty good. So now, when I run Get All Stock Info, I make sure I'm on the right sheet, and then make sure I'm in the right starting place to get all of this. And now I want it to do this part over and over and over again. And so I'm going to make what's called in programming lingo a loop. I'll say do, which in VBA just says, hey, this is the beginning of a loop. And then I'll say loop, which is the end of a loop. It says go back to the prior do. And I'll bring this in so I can kind of see it as part of this structure. So do says, hey, this is the beginning. Loop says go back to the do. So I'm going to call stock info, which will get the information from my current stock, plug it in here, and then move the active cell here. Then I'll say call stock info again, and it'll get this information, put me down here, it'll run it again. But at this point, I haven't given it any reason to stop, and I want it to know to stop when it's starting. I want it to check the active cell, and if the active cell doesn't have anything in it, I want it to stop. I want it to exit the loop. So the way I do that is with an until clause. By the way, this code will execute the way it is. It's not especially desirable because there's no way out of this loop. It'll have to run until it has an error. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and give it a way out. So I'm going to do until some condition is true. And what's that condition? Until the active cell The active cell's not its address, not its formula, not its color, but its value is equal to something. So if I was looking for some keyword in there, stop, until it finds the active cell that says stop, well, I don't want to have to put in the word stop to tell it to stop. For all I know, that could be a valid stock ticker. But I don't want to put, I could put stow, but same problem there. I don't want to just put st or even s. But if I go down to nothing, get rid of those characters, then I'm going to loop until I bump into an empty cell. It seems like a strange way to say empty cell, and there are other ways to check for an empty cell. But that's the simplest one. It is a collection of characters marked by the double quote, starts with a double quote, ends with a double quote, but there's nothing in it. And that's what an empty cell's value evaluates to. So now, if I look at the way that this procedure is going to run, it is going to pull in, it's going to start by selecting the sheet, going to the right place, and then it's going to continue to execute the stock info macro, the one that actually does the work, until it bumps into an empty cell, until the active cell is empty. So remember, Control-Shift-S still just runs stock info, so we need some way for the user to run this one, which we'll go ahead and take a look at right now. So what I'm going to do is, back on my Developer tab in my ribbon, I'm going to choose my little toolbox right here, and I'm going to choose the very first tool. So this tool is a button, and it allows me just to invoke some code from the form, or from the worksheet. So I'll select this button, I'll draw it here onto the sheet. It's going to say, oh, you're making a button, you probably want to run a macro. Yes, I want to run the macro called get all stock info. And we'll say OK. And maybe I should change this label to say get data. I'll click off of it, and now that button will become active, and I should be able to run this and have it pull the data in. Let's just go ahead and run it and see how it goes. So click get data. It's like it's pulling in the data from Apple. Now it's moving on to Google. Now Microsoft, Southwest Airlines, ExxonMobil, Ford, GM. I think that's the last one. And there it's brought all that data in. And so this has been a pretty good example. We record ourselves doing something, working with a more complex tool of Excel, bringing data in from a web page. We needed to do some modifications to that data, or to the macro that it recorded. We're able to create a loop and have it pull the data in. And in here, just a short time, we've been able to create what would be a pretty useful macro. All right, folks. Thanks for joining, and stay tuned for more videos.